500 people stood in the chandelier-lit atrium of the Manhattan auction house. Polished shoes, tailored blazers, billion-dollar net worth in that room alone. Then the door at the back opened. Mason Whitmore walked in, wrinkled flannel shirt, hands that had never known a manicure. Behind him, a 6-year-old girl holding a faded stuffed rabbit named Cog. The whispers started immediately. Someone said it looked like the wrong address. The billionaire owner of the destroyed Maserati, Victoria Chen, stood at the podium and smiled. The car sat on the platform behind her, a shell, a frame. 10 years in a storage facility after a fire had reduced it to charcoal and twisted metal. The auction house had listed it for exactly $500. A novelty lot. A tax write-off. What happened in the next 90 minutes would make headlines across 3 continents. Stay with this one. It earns it. The humiliation began at 7:43 in the evening. Victoria Chen's voice carried through the atrium with the assured tone of someone who had never been contradicted. She described the Maserati the way a funeral director might describe a corpse, with professional detachment and a hint of dark humor. The car, she explained, was beyond restoration. The engine block was fused. The frame had warped in the heat. It was scrap metal. That was the whole point. A charity auction. Buyers paid for the novelty of owning a famous wreck. Collectors bought destruction. The room understood this logic. They laughed. Victoria moved through the lot numbers quickly. A 1987 Ferrari sold for $2.3 million. A Range Rover, $3.1. Then she came to the Maserati. She held up a photograph of the car before the fire. Pristine red. A car that had belonged to her grandfather. She'd insured it for $7 million. Now it was worth scrap metal price. $500 starting bid. No reserve. The room was quiet. Not the quiet of nothing happening, but the quiet of a room where everyone understood the transaction was already over. That's when Mason raised his hand. Victoria's eyes found him. She did not smile, not at first. She looked at the wrinkled shirt, the work boots, the small girl at his side clutching the stuffed rabbit. She looked at his hands, calloused, stained, the hands of a man who repaired things for hourly wages. Then something shifted in her face. Not unkindness, not malice, simple recognition. He did not belong here, she almost laughed. The auctioneer's gavel fell to Mason's bid. $500. The room erupted. Laughter. Audible amusement. One man in the third row actually clapped. Victoria watched Mason sign the paperwork. She did not offer to shake his hand. She did not look at him again. But she watched his daughter, Ella, hold Cog close to her chest as the papers were signed. There was something in Victoria's expression then. Not pity, not contempt, something older than that. The satisfaction of someone watching a man buy a dream he could never achieve. Ella whispered to her father. Mason did not respond. He folded the papers. They walked toward the exit. Someone called out. Something about getting a good price on a paperweight. Another voice said the car was nicer as a sculpture. The laughter followed them, all the way to the door. Mason did not look back. He did not argue. He did not explain. He took Ella's hand and they walked out into the Manhattan night. The next morning, at 6:15 in the morning, Mason stood in a storage facility in Red Hook with the Maserati in front of him. He had not slept. The fluorescent lights were harsh. They showed everything. The frame was twisted. The interior was gone, burned down to the frame rails. The engine block was fused solid. The glass had melted and reformed into unrecognizable shapes. His ex-wife, Sarah, had loved Maseratis, had dreamed about owning one. She'd clipped pictures from magazines and taped them to the kitchen wall. She died 3 years ago. A car accident, not a Maserati, a Honda Civic. Bad luck, bad timing, bad everything. He'd kept the magazine clippings. They were still there, in a box in his apartment. Ella had found them once and asked why. He did not know what to tell her. He still didn't. He ran his hand along the frame. The metal was cold. The damage was absolute. Any other man would have taken the $500 loss and moved on. But Mason was not any other man. He had spent 14 years in the Army Corps of Engineers before his discharge. 4 years before that at MIT, in materials and automotive design. He had worked in precision restoration, not cars, but industrial machinery. He understood stress fractures. He understood how metal could be healed. He understood what was possible if you had the time and the knowledge and the refusal to accept the obvious answer. He texted his old mentor, Dominic. Dominic did not have a car business anymore. He was retired now, living upstate with a workshop in his barn. But he had been the chief engineer at a restoration house in Brooklyn for 30 years. He had taught Mason everything about cars in the 4 years they'd worked together. The text was simple. I need to know if something impossible is possible. Dominic called him back in 3 minutes. Mason explained what he'd bought. The silence on the line was long. Then Dominic said a single sentence. Bring it here. 3 days later, the Maserati sat in Dominic's barn. Dominic was 71 years old, silver-haired. He moved slowly now, but his eyes were the same eyes Mason remembered. Sharp, unflinching, the eyes of a man who could read metal the way other people read books. He walked around the car in silence. Mason watched him. Ella watched from the hay bales where she sat with Cog, dangling her legs. Dominic stopped at the rear axle. He crouched down. He ran his fingers along the stress fractures. He said, "It can be done." Mason did not react. He had already known, Dominic continued. The frame can be straightened in a furnace. Slow heat, precise pressure. The engine block is the real work. You'll need to machine it. Pull the block. Separate the cylinders. You'll lose the original. You'll rebuild from donor blocks. Same era, same spec. It won't be the original engine. But nobody will know. It'll run. It'll run perfectly. How long? Mason asked. 3 months if you work every day. 4 if you want it perfect. Dominic stood slowly. He knew already. He'd known before Mason opened his mouth. You know how much time this is. You know what you're giving up. Mason looked at his daughter. Ella was making Cog dance on the hay bales. She had not asked why they'd bought the broken car. She had accepted it the way children accept their father's inexplicable choices, with simple faith. Dominic said, "You still haven't told me why." Mason did not answer. "Not directly," he said. "She should know. Ella should know what's possible." Dominic nodded slowly. He understood. Dominic had known Sarah, had liked her. He'd been there when Mason learned she was gone. Dominic said, "Then we start tomorrow." The work began on a Monday in February. Mason worked nights at the mechanic shop where he'd taken a job 6 months earlier. Basic repairs, brake pads, tire rotations, the work that paid his rent. During the day, he was in Dominic's barn. He pulled the engine block. He disassembled it. He identified every damaged cylinder, every warped valve, every ruined bearing. He sourced parts. He worked without speed. He worked with precision. Every move was deliberate, nothing wasted. Dominic watched. He corrected. He nodded. He said very little, but his presence meant something. It meant that what Mason was doing was not impossible. It meant that a man could buy a destroyed car for $500 and make it whole. It meant that Ella was learning something without realizing she was learning it. That failure is not the end. That broken things can be made new. That her father was the kind of man who did not accept the obvious answer. At 3:15 in the afternoon on day 47, the engine turned over. It was a Tuesday. Dominic had gone to get lunch. Mason was alone. He had finished the last cylinder just before noon. The engine was assembled. The fuel lines were connected. The electrical was complete. He had been standing in the barn for 3 hours, simply looking at it, knowing the moment was coming, but not wanting to rush it. He turned the key. The engine coughed. Metal seized, then released. The second revolution was smoother. By the 5th, it was purring. By the 10th, it was singing. The sound was perfect, pristine. The sound of an engine that had been destroyed and made whole again. He let it run for exactly 4 minutes. Then he turned it off. He did not shout. He did not call anyone. He sat on the concrete floor of the barn and cried. Not with relief, not with triumph, with something older, with the memory of Sarah, who had loved Maseratis and would never see this one whole, with the knowledge that Ella was learning something about what her father was capable of, with the certainty that nothing good ever comes cheaply, and every step of this journey had cost him something, and he had paid gladly. Dominic returned at 4:30. He knew immediately. He looked at the engine. He looked at Mason. Dominic said, "When?" Mason said, "Tomorrow," and tomorrow came. The Maserati fired up. The frame had been straightened. The electrical had been completely rewired. The interior had been rebuilt to original spec. The paint had been stripped and applied in 7 layers. The leather had been sourced from the same tannery that supplied it in 1968. Everything was authentic. Everything was perfect. Nothing was original except the frame and the commitment. By the time the Maserati was finished, it was May. 4 months. Marcus had missed his daughter's school play. He had missed her 7th birthday. He had missed 7 Sundays with her because work was happening on those days. Ella had given up her time with him. She had given it willingly. She had sat in that barn, the only 6-year-old in Red Hook who understood combustion engines and chassis repair, and the patience required to make a destroyed thing whole. The first person who saw the finished car was Victoria Chen. She came because someone at the auction house had heard rumors. A mechanic had bought the destroyed Maserati, was restoring it. Rumors like that move fast in certain circles. The world of serious collectors is small. Victoria did not believe it was possible, but she came to Dominic's barn on a Tuesday in May to see for herself. She stood in front of the car for 5 minutes without speaking. The Maserati was perfect. The red was original, the exact shade from 1968. The interior was cream leather. The engine purred with the sound of machinery made whole. Every detail was exact. Every element was authentic or indistinguishable from authentic. She walked around it once, twice. She did not touch it. Then she asked the question that everyone asks in this situation. How much did you spend? Mason answered honestly. $82,000. Materials, parts, time. 4 months of labor. The labor, if billed at professional rates, would have been another $140,000. But he had not billed for the labor. That time had been given. Victoria said, "I want to buy it." Mason said, "It's not for sale." Victoria said, "Everything is for sale." "Name a price." Mason said, "No." Victoria had not heard the word no in approximately 14 years. She did not know how to process it. She tried again. $1 million. $2 million. 3. She moved through price points the way other people move through traffic lights. Each one met with the same response. No. Finally, she asked why. Why had he bought it? Why had he spent 4 months and $80,000 rebuilding a car that belonged to her, that she'd abandoned? Mason did not answer her directly. He asked Ella to bring Cog. Ella appeared from the office where she had been drawing. She held up the stuffed rabbit. Cog had been with her since birth. Cog had been with her when her mother died. Cog had watched her father rebuild this car. Mason said to Victoria, "My daughter's mother loved Maserati, says. She died before she got to own one. I bought this car because I wanted Ella to know that her father could do something impossible. That broken things can be made whole. That patience and knowledge and refusal to quit matter. The car isn't for sale because it was never about the car. It was about the lesson." Victoria looked at Ella. Ella held Cog close to her chest. Victoria said, "I would like to auction this car. For charity. The proceeds would go to pediatric cancer research. My brother died of cancer when he was 8 years old." Mason said, "At what price would you auction it?" $10 million. Mason did not say yes. He said, "We'll see what the market says. But if we auction it, I choose the auction house. I choose the terms. And the profits do not go to my account." They go to a scholarship fund for children whose parents are single. For families like mine, Victoria said agreed. The auction was held on July 15th. 347 collectors came from 12 countries. The bidding started at $2 million. It rose in increments of 500,000, 1 million, 1.5, 2. The room was silent. This was serious money. This was not entertainment. This was blood sport for people with access to capital. At 2.1 million, a Russian oligarch dropped out. At 3 million, a Saudi prince stopped bidding. At 4.2 million, a tech billionaire went silent. At 5.8 million, a private collector from London continued alone. Bid after bid, 5.9, 6.1, 6.5, at $7 million. A woman in the front row raised her paddle for the first time. She was an elderly woman, early 80s. She had not been bidding until that moment. Everyone turned to look at her. She was magnificent. She had the presence of someone who had owned beauty her entire life and was not impressed by money's ability to acquire it. 7.1, 7.5, 8 million. The London collector dropped out at 8.3. The bidding continued. 8.8, 9. The room knew what was happening. This was a moment. This was not acquisition. This was passion. This was someone who had decided that beauty was worth everything. At 9.2 million, the London collector raised his paddle one final time. The elderly woman did not hesitate. She raised her paddle immediately. $9.3 million. The gavel came down. The elderly woman stood. She walked to the front of the room where the Maserati sat. She placed her hand on the hood. She did not speak. She simply stood there, her hand on the red metal, her face visible to everyone in the room. That's when Victoria Chen realized what had happened. She had placed the car with a network she had access to. A network of women she knew. One of them had made the winning bid, on behalf of the woman in front of them. An 84-year-old widow named Eleanor Martinez. Her late husband had owned a Maserati. He'd promised to take her on a drive through Tuscany in it. He'd died before the trip could happen. Eleanor had mourned the lost promise for 37 years. Eleanor had just bought the restored Maserati so that she could fulfill the promise. Herself, the room understood. The room came to its feet, not in applause, in something deeper, in recognition. In the understanding that beauty and love and promise are worth more than comfort and safety. That broken things can be made whole. That a single father and his daughter and a stuffed rabbit and an old mold in a barn in Red Hook had made something perfect. And that perfect thing had just allowed an 84-year-old widow to keep a promise her dead husband could not. Victoria Chen's face was different now. Not the face of a billionaire who had abandoned a destroyed car for a tax write-off. Not the face of a woman who had mocked a mechanic at an auction. The face of someone who had been wrong and had watched someone else do something she could not do, and had to live with both facts at once. She walked to Mason. She said, "I was wrong about you," Mason said. "You didn't know me," Victoria said. "I know you now." She crouched down in front of Ella. Her expensive dress touched the concrete floor. She held out her hand and asked if she could hold Cog. Ella handed over the stuffed rabbit. Victoria held it for a long moment. She looked at the worn fabric, the patched ear, the condition of something loved completely for its entire life. She said to Ella, "Your father is the best person I've ever met." Ella said, "He makes pancakes on Sundays, but we can't have them until I tie my shoes right, because he says things done right are done once." Victoria's eyes filled with water. She handed Cog back to Ella. The paperwork was signed 3 days later. The $9.3 million went directly to the scholarship fund. Tax documents were filed. The charity that administered the fund was established. Within 5 years, it would fund the college education of 372 children whose single parents had shown that kind of commitment to their lives. The check was presented to Mason by Victoria on a Thursday evening. The presentation was private. It was not filmed. It was not posted. It was simply a moment in a quiet room where a billionaire handed a mechanic a check for $9.3 million and said, "This is yours. This is your family's," Mason said. "The scholarship is my family's. I don't want the money," Victoria said. "You've earned it," Mason said. "I earned the lesson. The lesson was enough." Victoria did not argue. She did not understand, but she did not argue. She folded the check and placed it in an envelope and handed it to Mason anyway. She said, "Even if you never cash it, I want you to have it." A week later, Mason and Ella were home. Home was a one-bedroom apartment in Sunset Park. Home was where the magazine clippings of Maseratis still hung on the kitchen wall. Home was where Mason made pancakes on Sunday mornings, and Ella tied her shoes, and they did everything right, which meant doing it once. On the Sunday after the auction, Mason made pancakes. Ella sat at the small table. She had Cog with her. She was tying her shoes. She got the knot wrong the first time. She undid it and tried again. The second time the knot held. She said, "Daddy, why did we fix the car if we weren't going to keep it?" Mason said, "Because your mom would have wanted you to know that broken things can be fixed." Ella said, "Does that mean when I'm broken, you can fix me?" Mason stopped moving. He stopped breathing. He set down the spatula. He said, "Yes, always. No matter what happens, no matter how broken things get, I can fix it." Ella held Cog up to her face like she was asking the rabbit a question. Then she looked at her father and smiled. She said, "Then we're not broken. We're just getting started." Mason picked up the pancakes. They were cooling. He set them on her plate. She picked up her fork and began to eat. He watched her. He thought about the destroyed car. He thought about 4 months of work. He thought about a moment when his hands made something perfect from something ruined. He thought about an 84-year-old woman standing in front of a red Maserati, keeping a promise her dead husband could not keep. He thought about his wife, about the magazine clippings on the wall, about how she was there in the room, even though she couldn't be, about how Ella would grow up knowing that her father had taken a dream someone else had abandoned and made it real. The pancakes grew cold as he watched his daughter eat. She did not rush. She held Cog with one hand and her fork with the other. The morning light came through the kitchen window. Outside, Brooklyn was moving. Trucks, cars, the sound of the city starting its day. Ella looked up at him. She didn't speak. She just smiled. She reached over with her free hand and took his. They sat like that, father and daughter. A stuffed rabbit on the table. Pancakes cooling. The scholarship fund papers in an envelope on the counter. Everything broken. Everything whole.